Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here, and today I'd like to give a brief introduction to Phoenician civilization. One thing I'd like to focus on is the separation between the Phoenicians and the larger Canaanite people, so we'll be talking about that. I'd also like to look at the historical development of the Phoenicians by focusing on their context and how they emerged and became what they were. I'd also like to look briefly at the culture of the Phoenician people and also at their historical contributions to the ancient world as a whole. So without any further ado, let's dig right in and talk about the Phoenician civilization. The Phoenicians are one part of the larger Canaanite community, so let's talk about what that community was. So the material evidence suggests that there was a unified Semitic-speaking culture that was present throughout the Levant, starting from before the development of agriculture and then developing consistently into the period of recorded history. So far as we can tell, based on various literary hints from both foreign sources and from sources within this area, the people there use the term Canaanite or something very similar to it to refer to themselves. Let's consider the geographical context of the emergence of Phoenician civilization. Greek historians tell us that the Phoenicians originally migrated from the vicinity of Bahrain. However, modern archaeology sees no evidence of any sort of mass-scale migration or invasion. Rather, they see steady development of native traditions and culture, and they see this steady development taking place over the period of about 2,000 years, between 3,200 or so, when civilization proper first emerges in Phoenicia, and 1200, which is approximately when the Bronze Age collapse occurred. As part of the Fertile Crescent, Phoenicia was located in one of the most fertile regions in the world and the first region to develop agriculture. And because Phoenicia lies on the route between Egypt and Mesopotamia, it is a major overland trade route, which means that a lot of people would make their living as merchants. Well, one thing that's unique about Phoenicia is that all of its cities are along the coast, and since they developed all of this trade knowledge from the overland routes, it was fairly natural for them to transition into being merchants by sea. So geography actually ends up playing a huge role in why the Phoenicians become such accomplished seafarers and merchants. As I mentioned above, a distinctly Canaanite civilization first starts to emerge in 3200 BCE, and that places it firmly within the early Bronze Age. Most of these cities are actually in the southern Levant during this period rather than the northern coast where the cities that we call Phoenicia would form. Of course, the early Bronze Age, the most characteristic feature of that time, the thing that most people associate with it, are the pyramids in Egypt, which were built around 2600 or so BCE. At the end of the early Bronze Age, a period which corresponds in Egyptian history with the first intermediary period, it appears that most of the Canaanite cities of the south were largely abandoned and that people returned to pastoralism and earlier lifestyles. The reason for this is that there was a slight climatic shift and that this really threw off agriculture just enough that it caused trade routes to decline. And without trade routes functioning at a high level, it's hard to keep cities going when you have an economy which is based primarily on subsistence agriculture. Of course, once the climate recovers, all of these cities would be resettled and would then reach greater heights than they had before. The period between 2000 and 1550 BCE is the Middle Bronze Age, and this was a period with some fairly major developments for the Canaanites. At this time, urbanism made a return, and the earlier cities developed into more full-fledged city-states. Among these city-states, the most prominent during this period seems to have been Hazor. This group of cities as a whole was referred to as Amuru by the Mesopotamians, and it was seen as one of the four corners of the civilized world by the people living in Mesopotamia at this time. As for the Egyptians, they suffered invasion at the hands of some Canaanites and they labeled them as the Hyksos, whereas the northern inhabitants who lived around the place where we would now call Phoenicia were called Amorites. It looks like the prosperity of Canaan, meaning especially the southern part, the southern inland Canaanites, that their peak of prosperity was around 1600 or so, and that politically they were organized into a few different confederacies, each of which was dominated by a strong city-state. Of course, Hazor dominated one of these coalitions. During the Late Bronze Age, new Canaanite coalitions under the leadership of Kadesh and Megiddo emerged and became prominent. Early on in the Late Bronze Age, which started around 1550 or so, these confederations ended up being conquered by the Hittites and New Kingdom Egypt. At this time, different portions of the Canaanite people came to be under the rule of different empires in the region, and this difference may have accounted for some of the cultural drift between the various parts of the Canaanite people. But from the Late Bronze Age on, there are differences between the Phoenicians in the north and their cousins in the south. So now we can begin to talk about the Phoenicians proper without reference to what is going on in the south. The Late Bronze Age was dominated by four empires: the Egyptians, the Mitanni, the Hittites, and the Assyrians. Of those four empires, Phoenicia constantly passed between the hands of two of them, the Hittites and the Egyptians. The political development and economic prosperity of Phoenicia was impeded by the demands of their imperial neighbors and by the disruptions caused by the various invasions that occurred during this time. And in many ways, Canaan as a whole was more or less a battlefield of empires for the entirety of the Late Bronze Age. The city of Kadesh, which started out as a center for a Canaanite coalition, became a chess piece in a war between Egypt and the Hittites, which never seemed to end. And the first recorded battle in history where we have details of what happened was actually the Battle of Kadesh, which was fought in 1274 and featured the megalomaniacal pharaoh Ramses II. But anyway, the Phoenicians would have been mostly influenced in a negative way by these events, and they were never really able to flourish the way that they could had these empires not been breathing down their necks this entire time. If we look at major overarching events and judge their importance for the Phoenician civilization, then it's hard to really point to an event that is more significant than the Bronze Age collapse, which occurred between about 1200 and 1150 or so BCE. And what happened during this so-called collapse is that the Hittites, Egyptians, and Assyrians all went into steep decline, and the Mycenaean civilization in Greece completely and totally collapsed. And because these scholars who labeled this had a background that centers around Greek and Western history, therefore it is a collapse rather than a prolonged depression or something of that nature. What we see, though, is that across the board, almost everyone experiences lower prosperity and trade volumes decline fairly dramatically. However, things don't work that way for the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are the beneficiaries of the problems their neighbors had, because now, rather than being oppressed by their imperial neighbors, their neighbors are no longer able to exert force into Phoenicia, and the Phoenician city-states are able to develop on their own accord and to set sail to find new trade routes and do other things that before they had not been able to do. So let's now talk about the final breakup of the Canaanite people. The Bronze Age collapse began around 1200 or so BCE, and then the traditional powers like the Neo-Assyrians began to emerge around 900 or so. And it was during this general time period when a division emerged between the inland Canaanites and the coastal Phoenicians, which had some relevance. What it looks like from archaeology is that the religion that we now call Judaism was the product of a cultural revolution which occurred among some of the inland Canaanites, and that part of this religious revolution was redefining their ethnicity vis-a-vis their neighbors who did not share their beliefs, and that they more or less created an artificial difference between themselves and the Canaanites who happen to live elsewhere, like the Phoenicians. However, it looks like there were still a lot of cultural similarities. The languages were very similar, and it's also pretty clear that there were a lot of contacts between the inland and the coast. One example is in the Bible when Solomon is building his temple, he hires a bunch of workers from Tyre to do the majority of the construction for it. Also, another thing about this religious revolution is that it was probably a lot more localized than things like the Bible would want you to believe. It looks like the kingdom of Israel and Judah were never united, for instance, and it also looks like the kingdom of Israel never abandoned its pagan beliefs in favor of Judaism. But that's almost a different topic for a different day, so I will let that pass for now and get back to the northern coast where the Phoenicians live. In Greece, the years between 1200 and 800 were a dark age. There was no writing and very little city life. We really don't have a great idea of what was going on in Greece. However, the exact opposite is true for Phoenicia. This was their golden age, these same exact years. And for them, the reason why this was a golden age is because the traditional empires that had once threatened their borders and imposed taxation on them were no longer able to oppress them. So the cities of Phoenicia were then able to really prosper, exercise power, and achieve a great deal of prosperity. So let's look at the achievements of the Phoenicians during the Golden Age. Let's begin by looking at the political organization of the Phoenician city-states. From what we can tell, all of them had kings, and they also featured a strong priestly class. The priestly class had a lot of religious functions, obviously, but in many ways they seem to have also corresponded with an aristocracy in the more traditional sense. The major centers in prime Phoenicia were Tyre, Byblos, Sidon, Samira, Arwad, and Berytus, and these centers would compete with one another for dominance during this period. Early on, Byblos was the dominant trading power, but in later times, Tyre came to dominate with King Ithobaal, who ruled between 887 and 856, ruling as far north as Beirut and also conquering part of the island of Cyprus. For outsiders who were not Phoenician, this area as a whole was either called Sidonia after the city of Sidon or Tyria after the city of Tyre at different times, depending on which city was in the ascendant at any given moment. Every civilization that wants to engage in large-scale commerce has to have some sort of product that they export to foreign markets. For the Phoenicians, this product is the purple dye known as Tyrian Purple Dye, and it looks like this dye was probably discovered around the year 1570 or so BCE. The special property of this dye is that it doesn't fade easily, and in fact, it will actually brighten with exposure to sunlight, at least for some amount of time. This became a prized product, and it really became the thing that the Phoenician world became known for. A lot of the places where the Phoenicians would plant down colonies would be places that also were able to produce this dye because they had the right kind of mollusk around from which to harvest it. This product became so popular and so sought after that purple will be the color of power and authority for both the Greeks and the Romans. So Greek rulers would wear purple, and Roman consuls in the Senate would have a big purple stripe on their white togas to denote their power and authority. Now that the Phoenicians had their specialty product, they needed a way to convey it to foreign markets. Ships before this period seem to have not been quite as adept at sailing long distances, and it looks like we owe many naval innovations to the Phoenicians, although really specifying what those are can be a bit tricky. The first warships emerged all the way back in the 14th century BCE, and it looks like the Phoenicians were more interested in exploration and trade than in warfare. One thing that we know about Phoenician ships is that during the Persian War, Phoenician ships were called up to serve with the Persian navy, and while they were agile and well helmed, they were no match for the Greek triremes, which were a lot sturdier and easily defeated them when they met head on in the straits at Artemisium and at Salamis. The combination of advanced shipbuilding and mercantile ambition meant that the Phoenicians fanned out across the Mediterranean and that they were as much navigators and explorers as merchants. It looks like the Phoenicians may have been able to reach as far afield as Britain due to the presence of some Phoenician artifacts. However, that also could just be artifacts that were traded from the Phoenicians to someone else and then retraded until they reached Britain. It's really hard to say. One thing that we have on slightly firmer ground, however, is that there's a strong tradition among the Greeks that there was a Carthaginian explorer named Hanno the Navigator who explored the west coast of Africa and possibly went as far south as Gabon. However, we don't really have any sources written in the Punic language to corroborate this, and it's more or less just a Greek tradition about the Carthaginians. At any rate, though, it does show that the Greeks respected the Phoenicians and their Carthaginian descendants and their ability to explore and navigate on rough seas. In addition to exploring for new markets, the Phoenicians also needed a way to keep records to manage all of the trade that they engaged in, and this led them to develop the alphabet. And the Phoenician development of the alphabet around the year 1050 or so BCE is by far their greatest contribution to civilization as a whole. This alphabet is the oldest verified alphabet. There are some people who have theories about earlier alphabets, but none of those have quite panned out as of yet. We have found related fragments that are similar to the script of the Phoenician alphabet, and those fragments are generally just referred to under the category of Proto-Canaanite if they date from before 1050 or so. And once this alphabet was developed and in use, it was spread by Phoenician merchants and colonists everywhere that they went. One important variation close to home for the Phoenicians was the development of an Aramaic script, and this Aramaic script then went on to heavily influence the Hebrew and Arabic scripts that came later. As for the Phoenician alphabet that was spread by Phoenician merchants, however, this went on to influence the Greeks and give them the basis for their alphabet, and it was the Greek alphabet which in turn influenced the Latin alphabet, and between the two of them, they accounted for the chief influences on all of the various alphabets in Europe, from the Cyrillic alphabet to the English one. So this is actually a major development, and it had a profound effect on Western civilization. Let's take a cursory look at Phoenician myth and religion. So, first of all, one of the great myths about the Phoenicians and Canaanites is that they had some sort of supreme deity called Baal. This seems to be sort of the generic Christian understanding of this time period. However, the term Baal is actually a lot more general, and it really just means something more like Lord, and this is something that really gets applied to all of the gods. It's also incorporated into a lot of Phoenician names. For instance, Hannibal, or Hasdrubal. There are many gods and heroes in the Phoenician tradition who correspond very closely with figures in the Greek tradition. The only example that I know right offhand is the correspondence between the Greek Heracles and the Phoenician Melkart. There are some differences in what they do, but a lot of the basics are the same, so far as I am aware. So, for instance, Heracles famously slayed the Nemean lion, who was impenetrable, and he did so by strangling him, whereas Melkart had to kill a rampaging lion, but he did so with his sword. So there are clearly some differences, but it looks like there were some shared traditions at one point. Later, during the Hellenistic period, when the Greeks heavily settled in the Near East, Hellenistic philosophers, especially the Stoics, had a tendency to engage in what is known as syncretism, where they try to show that all religions are fundamentally the same, and that the major differences are only ones of language and labels. So they did a lot of work really equating Greek and Phoenician deities and myths, and it's also very possible that their work in this regard has obscured some real and significant differences that may have existed. But I actually don't know as much as I'd like to about this particular topic, and it's something that I might revisit in the future when I have acquired more information. During the Golden Age, the Phoenicians also engaged in large scale colonization efforts in the Western Mediterranean. The primary motive for this seems to have been advancing their commercial interest by establishing colonies in areas which had things that they wanted and markets that they wished to exploit. It's also possible that they were trying to alleviate population pressure at home and give people an outlet to escape. It's also very probable, based on the story of Queen Dido, that some of these colonization efforts began due to political pressure at home and due to factions that had irreconcilable differences, and the easiest solution was simply for one of the factions to go into exile and start a colony somewhere else. Tyre founded Barcelona in Spain in the 9th century and then went on to found Carthage in 814. Carthage, of course, going on to be by far the most important of all of these colonies. There are also Phoenician colonies in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and North Africa. However, this effort at colonizing the Western Mediterranean was heavily tamped down once the Greeks began their own colonization efforts in the region around 750 or so BCE, as they emerged from their Dark Age into the Archaic period. So, while the Bronze Age collapse had been kind to the Phoenicians, it was also true that the Iron Age recovery would be equally unkind to them, whereas it would help everyone else. So, as their neighbors began to recover and grow, and the old empires began to expand back into their old holdings, this really puts the squeeze on the Phoenicians in terms of their political independence and their economic prosperity. The Neo-Assyrian Empire from 911 to 612 and the Neo-Babylonian Empire from 626 to 539 both conquer the region of Phoenicia and impose taxation on the region. And in addition to these problems that they're suffering at home, as I mentioned above, another thing that holds the Phoenicians back is the rise of the Greeks, who are now preventing more colonization in the West and starting to cut into Phoenician trade routes by attacking colonies in some cases, and also by setting up rival colonies and having rival merchant ships prowling around the Mediterranean. While Phoenicia's experience under most empires was pretty negative, they seem to have really prospered under the control of Persia. So in 539, Cyrus and his Achaemenid Persian Empire conquered the Neo-Babylonians and therefore came into possession of Phoenicia. And the Persians would continue to control this region until 332. During this time, the Persians organized the area into 4 vassal kingdoms, each one centered around a major city, so Byblos, Sidon, Arwad, and Tyre. And generally speaking, the Phoenicians seem to have continued to prosper under Persian rule. A lot of this is due to the fact that Persian rule tended to be fairly hands-off and not very intrusive. The Persians did not impose any of their own culture on their subjects, and they also didn't impose religious change or the adoption of the Persian language. So the Phoenicians were more or less semi-independent, at least from the perspective of being able to continue their commercial activities and being able to practice their culture and religion however they saw fit. However, all people strive for independence, even against empires that are more or less benevolent. Again, though, an empire can only be so good. There was a revolt in Sidon against the empire, possibly just a local satrap trying to break free, but also possibly an uprising of the Phoenicians as such. And this ended up being crushed, and the city itself ended up being destroyed by the Persian imperial forces sometime between 350 and 345. So while this was mostly a positive experience for the Phoenicians, there were some troubles, as you might imagine, and the destruction of Sidon certainly has to be the low point in that relationship. Persian rule in Phoenicia ended due to the conquest of Persia by Alexander and his successors. So, when Alexander was invading Persia in the year 332, he was passing through Phoenicia, and most of the cities that he encountered surrendered. However, the city of Tyre decided to resist, and it had heavily fortified itself in recent times. One of the things that it had done is put a second citadel on the island in its harbor, so New Tyre as opposed to Old Tyre on the coast. And because the Tyrians had a fleet and Alexander did not, they felt like they were invincible and that they didn't need to submit to him. However, Alexander didn't want to leave a potentially hostile force in his rear, and he didn't believe the Tyrians when they said that they would be loyal to him and not betray him. So the result was a 7-month siege, and it ended up being one of the greatest challenges of Alexander's entire career. He eventually did construct a mole across the waterway connecting the mainland with the island, and he also built up a fleet and ferried some men over. The result was a bloody sack of Tyre. And this was really the last great hurrah for the Phoenicians in terms of making a real bid for political independence or power, unless you count what the Carthaginians did in the west. And so they did definitely go out with a bang. Alexander never struggled with another opponent as much as he struggled with the Tyrians. So I guess that is a pretty good way to go out if you manage to give headaches to the greatest general who ever lived. So that is the Siege of Tyre. After Alexander's death, Greek and Macedonian settlers began to arrive in large numbers in the spear-won lands of Asia and Egypt. One area that was particularly appealing to Greek settlers was Phoenicia. After all, it was somewhere that was not all that different from home. It was on the coast, there was a lot of mercantile activity, and this was a place where you could get papyrus relatively cheaply. So the process of Hellenization began due to Greek cultural domination. And what this process is where you have locals who begin to take up Greek culture, speak Greek, and use their newfound Greekness in order to advance themselves in society, to enter government and do all kinds of other stuff. The Phoenicians were among the people who engaged in Hellenization the most heavily. And it was also during this period where the Phoenicians began to communicate with the Greeks in detail, and we have a lot of Greek history books being written which include incidents from Phoenician history. So most of the traditions that we have relating to Phoenician history actually come from this period. And the two empires of the successors which will rule over the Phoenicians are Ptolemaic Egypt, which will dominate the area for most of this period, and then the Seleucid Empire, which will dominate it later. Hellenization is a complex and variable process which impacted different regions in different ways. However, the Phoenicians seem to have been impacted the most strongly and noticeably out of all of the various people that I'm familiar with who ended up being Hellenized. So it looks like the Phoenician identity was more or less completely lost as people began to adopt Greek institutions, culture, and language. Many other cultures managed to survive being Hellenized, and sometimes it was only the upper classes who Hellenized, but it looks like in Phoenicia that this was something that occurred on a large scale. And so far as I'm aware, by the time Pompey annexed the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, which included Phoenicia in 65 BCE, there really wasn't much of a Phoenician culture left. It's also possible that the efforts of Antiochus IV to forcibly Hellenize the region had a great impact here, and that some of that Hellenization was by force. However, I tend to think that due to some of the existing similarities between the Greeks and the Phoenicians, that Hellenizing was a lot more palatable to the Phoenicians than to most people, and that was actually a bigger factor than the efforts of Antiochus IV. But in this, I'm more or less speculating, and I don't truly know why the Phoenicians abandoned their culture, or if it was more or less entirely gone by 65. I do know that it was greatly diminished, however, and that this is more or less how the story of Phoenician civilization ends, with a whimper. It's actually a pretty sad ending, I think. The Phoenicians are often overlooked or relegated to a footnote. However, they actually had a profound impact on the course of Western civilization. By developing the alphabet, they unlocked the key to widespread literacy and the development of Western literature. While it would be possible for literature and widespread literacy to exist without an alphabet, see East Asia, these things give Western civilization some of its distinctive features. And it also allows for the development of written versions of native languages in the West. By helping to pioneer trade routes and ship designs, the Phoenicians really laid the groundwork for trade routes and economic patterns that would last for centuries. They also had a crucial influence on archaic Greece. It's very unlikely that the Greeks and their civilization would have taken the turn that it did were it not for the heavy influence of the Phoenicians. Of course, the Tyrians also had a colony at Carthage, and Carthage would grow up to be the greatest rival that Rome ever faced. There's also the possibility that Carthage could have ended up emerging victorious from the Punic Wars, in which case Phoenicia would be seen as the homeland of Western civilization rather than as a side note. Of course, purple dye would remain a standard color of power and authority for the rest of antiquity, and this tradition would last into the Middle Ages. So the Phoenicians were pretty important, even if they often get overlooked, and I hope that this brief introduction to the Phoenicians has helped to spark your interest in the topic and give you some basic idea of who the Phoenicians were and why they mattered. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.